He controlled the city's underground, drowning in women who loved his wallet and feared his gun. So he put on a thrift store jacket and pretended to be nobody. Dozens walked past him in disgust, but she didn't. She just offered him half her sandwich, not knowing she had just passed a mob boss's deadliest test. Roman Costa sat on an overturned milk crate in the alley behind a diner, letting the damp November cold seep through the cheap denim jacket he'd bought at a local charity shop. It smelled like mothballs and wet dog. He hated it. He hated the grime he'd intentionally rubbed under his fingernails, sourced from the undercarriage of a rusted Chevy truck. He rubbed a thumb over his index finger, feeling the abrasive grit. It was a Tuesday. It was raining. Inside, his real life was waiting. A sprawling penthouse overlooking the city, smelling of cedarwood and expensive scotch. A crew of men who would gut their own brothers if Roman gave a subtle nod. Women with razor-sharp cheekbones and hollow, calculating eyes who looked at him like he was an ATM that dispensed diamonds and danger. He was suffocating in silk. The test he had devised was brutally simple. Strip the power, strip the money. Strip away the Rolex and the tailored Italian wool. See who looks at a broke, dirty man with anything other than revulsion. For 3 weeks he swept the floors of Mick's diner on the graveyard shift. He bumped into regulars. He fumbled with a mop. He watched beautiful, ambitious women, the exact kind who usually hung off his arm at charity galas, flinch when his stained jacket brushed their coats. They pulled their designer bags closer. They wiped their hands if he handed them a menu. They looked right through him. To the world of the wealthy and aspirational, he was a ghost. Then came Maggie. She wasn't small. She didn't glide silently into a room. When Maggie walked in, the floorboards creaked beneath her boots. She had broad shoulders, thick hips, and wore a bulky beige sweater that looked like it had survived a decade of brutal washing cycles. She carried an oversized canvas tote bag that seemed to weigh 40 pounds, the straps digging deep into her shoulder. Roman was mopping near booth 4 when she sat down. The smell of industrial bleach was sharp, stinging his nose, battling a losing war against the ambient scent of stale fryer grease. She ordered a black coffee and a plate of fries, not a side salad, not a delicate pastry to pick at. Roman accidentally knocked the wooden handle of his mop against the edge of her table. Deliberate clumsiness, a calculated intrusion. He braced for the sneer, the sharp tongue. Watch it creep. That's what the blonde in the red dress had spat at him 2 nights ago. Maggie looked up. Her eyes were tired, a muted hazel. Dark bags hung under them, bruised purple against pale skin, betraying chronic exhaustion. Sorry, Roman mumbled. He kept his head down, shoulders slouched, forcing his voice into a raspy, defeated pitch. Maggie didn't scoff. She didn't wipe down the table where the mop handle had touched. Instead, she nudged her plate of fries toward him. It's slippery, she said. Her voice was surprisingly low, a raspy alto. Don't break your neck for minimum wage, it's not worth it. Roman stared at the fries. A bead of sweat dripped down his neck, stinging from the cheap fabric of his collar. I'm fine. You look like you haven't slept since Thursday, man. She took a sip of her coffee, wincing slightly at the heat. Sit for a second. Mick's in the back doing inventory. He won't see. Roman hesitated. He leaned the mop against the faux leather booth. He didn't sit, but he stood close. He smelled vanilla. It was a cheap lotion, probably from a massive drugstore pump bottle, layered over the faint, sour scent of rain and physical exhaustion. I'm Roman, he said, a half-truth. Maggie, she replied. She didn't offer her hand for a shake, just gave a slow nod. She pushed the plate an inch closer. Eat a fry, Roman, before I eat them all and hate myself. He took one. It was lukewarm, limp, and heavy with salt. It tasted better than the $200 steak he'd had at an offshore syndicate meeting a month prior. He watched her as he chewed. She was hyper-aware of the space she took up, keeping her elbows tucked in tight to her ribs, minimizing her footprint in the cramped booth. Society had relentlessly taught her to apologize for existing, and her body language reflected it. He ate a second fry. She gave a small, genuine smile. It didn't reach her eyes, but it softened the hard line of her jaw. Roman went back to mopping without saying thank you. But for the first time in 6 years, The tight, cold knot behind his ribs loosened. Just a fraction. The charade continued into the bleakest parts of November. Roman ordered his underboss, Paulie, to handle the violence at the shipping docks. Instead of breaking fingers, Roman spent his nights pushing a broom and dragging leaking trash bags to the alley. The sour juice from the garbage seeped into his scuffed boots. Maggie came in every Tuesday and Thursday. Roman learned she worked at a predatory collections call centre a few blocks down. He started lingering near her booth, wiping down the same spotless patch of counter just to listen. He learned she had a laugh that sounded like an old engine turning over. Rough, loud, and completely unapologetic. He also learned she was broke. Desperately so. One Thursday, the diner was practically deserted. The rain was turning to sleet, rattling violently against the single-pane windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. The heater in the corner hummed, smelling of burning dust. Roman stood near the register, wiping down laminated menus with a damp grey rag. Maggie sat at her usual booth, digging frantically through her tote bag. She pulled out a worn fabric wallet, opened it, sighed. The sound was heavy, ragged. It was the sound of a math problem that had no solution. She walked up to the counter. "Hey, Mick." Mick, a balding man with a permanent scowl and grease-stained apron, grunted from the grill. "Yeah? Can I get a coffee to go and put the fries on my tab? I get paid Monday." Mick aggressively flipped a burger patty. Grease sizzled, popping loud like firecrackers. "Tab's cut off, Maggie. You owe $22 from last month. I run a business, not a charity for big girls with big appetites." Maggie froze. Her face flushed instantly, a deep blotchy red creeping up her thick neck. Shame. It was a tangible bitter thing in the air. "Right. Sorry. Just the coffee then. I have $1. Roman stopped wiping the menus. His grip tightened on the rag until his knuckles turned white beneath the artificial grease. He had a sterling silver money clip in his left pocket, currently holding $3,000 in hundreds. He could buy this pathetic diner, raze it to the dirt and build a parking garage over the ashes. He could drag Mick over the counter by his thin hair and snap his fingers backward for disrespecting her. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his cheap denim jacket. He pulled out a crumpled, stained $20 bill, a prop he kept for the disguise. He walked over, sliding the 20 across the scratch formica counter. "Put a tab on this," Roman said. His voice was gravelly, low. Mick sneered, wiping his hands on a filthy towel. "Since when do you have $20 to spare, sweeper?" "Since I said so." Roman's tone dropped further. He lost the meek janitor act for a split second, slipping into a cold, flat cadence. It was the exact tone that made hardened criminals sweat through their shirts in interrogation rooms. Mick blinked, visibly unnerved by the sudden, terrifying chill in the janitor's eyes, and snatched the bill. Maggie grabbed Roman's arm. Her grip was startlingly strong. "No, Roman, no, you need that." "I don't." "You're wearing shoes with duct tape on the heels," she hissed, pulling him away from the counter toward the glass door. She smelled like wet wool now. Her eyes were wide, panicked. "You work for tips and minimum wage. I am not taking your money." "It's $20, Maggie. It's not a mortgage." "It's your grocery money," she argued, crossing her thick arms defensively over her chest. She looked down at his ruined boots, then back up at his face. "I'm fat, Roman. I'm not going to starve if I miss one plate of fries." The self-deprecation hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't fishing for a compliment. It was a brutal, cynical statement of fact in her mind. It was how the world had taught her to survive. "I didn't buy you fries," Roman said, stepping closer. He invaded her space, forcing her to look up at him. "I paid a debt so that grease-stained idiot stops talking to you like you're a burden. You aren't a burden." Maggie stared at him. The flush in her cheeks remained, but the intense shame morphed into something entirely different. Confusion. Vulnerability. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. No one had defended her in a very long time. "I'll pay you back Monday," she whispered, the fight draining out of her. "Don't worry about it." "I'm paying you back, Roman." She jabbed a thick finger into his chest, right over his heart. "Monday." She pushed past him, shoving the glass door open and stepping out into the sleet. Roman stood by the door, watching her broad silhouette disappear down the grey, freezing street. He touched his chest right where she had poked him. He felt the frigid draft from the door, but his blood was running hot. He wanted to give her the world. He wanted to buy her the bank that owned her debts. But he needed to see the end of the test. Monday night. The diner was packed. The air was thick, suffocating with the smell of fried onions, damp coats, and cheap black coffee. Maggie came in right at 11 p.m. She looked dead on her feet, her damp hair pulled into a messy, frizzing bun. She marched straight past the empty booths, making a beeline for Roman, who was wiping down a sticky table in the corner. She slapped a crisp, newly printed $20 bill onto the table. "Told you," she said, breathing heavily. Roman looked at the bill, then at her. "Keep it. Take it, Roman, or I'm shoving it down your throat." A low, genuine chuckle rumbled in his chest, vibrating through his rib cage. "Violent. Principled," she corrected, sliding heavily into the nearest booth. "Now get me a coffee before I fall asleep sitting up and Mick charges me rent." It was 1 a.m. when the trouble started. 3 men walked in. Roman clocked them instantly. They weren't his men. They were low-level street trash, the kind of muscle that dealt pills out of alleyways and thought they owned the neighborhood because they had pocket knives. They wore cheap leather jackets, had aggressive swagger, and brought in the stench of stale weed and sour beer. They sat 2 booths down from Maggie. Roman was in the back, tossing heavy garbage bags into the metal dumpster. The cold air bit viciously at his knuckles. When he walked back through the swinging kitchen doors, he heard the laughter, mean and jagged hyena laughter. "Hey Shamu," one of the men called out. "You're going to break the booth. They charge by the pound here." Roman froze in the walkway. His hand instinctively twitched toward the small of his back, where he usually kept a suppressed Sig Sauer. He wasn't wearing it. He was wearing flannel. He looked at Maggie. She was staring rigidly at her coffee cup, gripping it with both hands. Her shoulders were hunched, drawing inward, making herself as small as physically possible. The armor was up. She was used to this. She was actively pretending she couldn't hear them, hoping they would get bored. "I asked you a question," Pork Chop, the largest of the 3, mocked. He stood up, taking a deliberate step toward her booth. He reached out and grabbed her oversized tote bag from the vinyl seat. "What's in here? Snacks?" "Put it down," Maggie said. Her voice was shaking just a fraction. "Or what?" the man sneered, unzipping the top. Roman didn't think. The janitor disguise evaporated. The restraint vanished entirely. He crossed the diner floor in 3 impossibly fast, silent strides. He grabbed the man by the back of his neck. His grip was a steel vice, fueled by years of brutal street enforcement. Before the man could even register the touch, Roman drove his face directly into the hard edge of the Formica table. The squelch of flesh and the sickening wet crunch of cartilage echoed loudly over the diner's speakers playing low jazz. The diner went dead silent. Only the hiss of the grill and the dripping of the coffee machine remained. The man collapsed backward onto the linoleum, groaning, dark blood pouring rapidly from a shattered nose. His 2 friends jumped up, swearing, their hands reaching aggressively into their jackets. Roman turned to them. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself. He didn't take a boxer's stance. He simply looked at them. His posture was perfectly straight, radiating a cold, predatory, murderous authority. His eyes were entirely dead. "Leave," Roman said quietly. It wasn't a shout, it was an executioner's promise. The 2 thugs froze. They looked down at the blood pooling rapidly on the black and white tiles, then back at Roman's face. Pure animal instinct kicked in. They recognized a predator, even one wearing a thrift store jacket. They didn't pull their knives. They grabbed their bleeding, sobbing friend by the collar and scrambled out the door, the bell jingling cheerfully as they bolted into the night. Mick was staring from behind the counter, his jaw hanging open, spatula completely forgotten in his hand. Roman looked down at his own right hand. His knuckles were split. Blood, his or the thug's, he wasn't entirely sure, was smeared thick across his skin. Adrenaline pounded heavily in his ears, muting the room. He realized his colossal mistake immediately. Janitors don't move like that. Men sweeping floors for minimum wage don't shatter faces with surgical, emotionless precision. He turned slowly to Maggie. She wasn't looking at him with awe. She wasn't swooning. She was staring at his bloody hand. She stood up. Her broad frame was trembling slightly, not from fear of him, but from the sudden, violent adrenaline dump of the confrontation. She reached out and ripped a massive handful of harsh brown napkins from the metal dispenser. "You absolute idiot," she breathed. She stepped close to him, ignoring the blood on the floor. She took his hand. Her touch was warm, her calloused thumb gently wiping the blood from his split skin, the rough napkin scratching against his knuckles. "They could have had knives, Roman," she scolded, her voice thick and wet. "They could have killed you over a stupid, pathetic joke about my weight." "It wasn't a joke," Roman said quietly. He didn't look at his hand. He stared directly at the top of her messy hair as she worked. "And I don't care." She looked up abruptly, her hazel eyes meeting his dark ones. They were only inches apart. He could see the exhaustion lining her face, but also a fierce protective fire. The sharp, metallic smell of fresh blood mixed heavily with her cheap vanilla lotion. "You're going to get fired," she whispered frantically, glancing over his shoulder. "Mick is already picking up the phone. He's calling the cops." "Let him." "No." She dropped the bloody napkins on the table and grabbed his uninjured arm. Her grip was desperate. "You can't afford to get arrested. You don't have the money to make bail. Come on, you're coming to my place. We need to go now." She didn't wait for his answer. She grabbed her tote bag and pulled the millionaire mob boss out the back door, rushing him into the freezing rain, risking everything to protect the man she thought had absolutely nothing. Maggie's apartment was on the 4th floor of a brick building that had surrendered to gravity decades ago. The staircase smelled of boiled cabbage, damp dust, and ammonia. The linoleum steps were warped, peeling at the corners, protesting with loud, sharp squeaks under their boots. Roman followed her up, listening to the heavy, laboured rhythm of her breathing. She didn't complain, but he saw how she leaned against the railing at the second landing, dragging her massive tote bag like an anchor. He reached out and pulled the bag from her shoulder. She flinched, instinctively resisting, but he simply took it. It was heavy enough to give a lesser man back spasms. "I've got it," he murmured. She shot him a glare, a mix of exhaustion and stubborn pride, but let her arm drop. When she unlocked door 4B, the air inside hit him. It was freezing. The radiator in the corner was dead, completely silent, offering nothing but flaking silver paint. The apartment consisted of one room serving as a kitchen, living area and bedroom, divided only by a faded floral curtain hanging from a tension rod. Roman stepped inside and gently set the bag on a wobbly wooden chair. He took it all in. The worn, flattened cushions of the love seat, the single window overlooking an alleyway, its glass rattling violently against the wind. But the most damning detail was the kitchen table. It was covered in stacks of envelopes. Some were ripped open, their jagged edges revealing dense paragraphs of aggressive legal threats. Others were still sealed, bearing bright red stamps. Final notice, past due, action required. Beside the envelope sat a half-eaten sleeve of generic saltine crackers and a jar of cheap peanut butter. Roman stared at the table. A cold, heavy stone settled deep in his stomach. It wasn't the cold of the room. It was the chilling realization of his own profound arrogance. He had billions in offshore accounts. He owned cargo ships, judges, and entire blocks of commercial real estate. When he wanted to disappear, he put on a dirty jacket and pretended to live in this world. It was a vacation for him, a social experiment. But for Maggie, this was a cage. She couldn't take the jacket off. She couldn't walk away from the final notices. She was drowning, treading water every single day, and she had just thrown her last life preserver to him. "Sit," Maggie ordered, pointing to the love seat. Her voice was raspy, shaking slightly from the cold. She vanished behind the floral curtain and returned a moment later holding a rusted tin lunchbox. She dropped onto the cushion beside him. The springs groaned painfully under their combined weight. She smelled intensely of the rain outside and the stale grease of the diner. But beneath it all, the soft, familiar trace of vanilla lotion grounded him. She opened the tin. Inside were a few crumpled alcohol wipes, half a roll of electrical tape and a few loose bandages. No neosporin, no gauze, just the absolute bare minimum for survival. She grabbed his right hand. Her fingers were thick, her calluses rough, but her touch was incredibly gentle. She tore open an alcohol wipe. "This is going to sting," she warned, not looking at his face. She pressed the wipe into the split skin over his knuckles. Roman didn't flinch. He didn't feel the sting of the alcohol. He only felt the overwhelming gravity of her proximity. "You're a complete idiot, Roman," she whispered. The anger in her voice had burned out, leaving only a raw, desperate fear. "Mick is going to give the cops your description. You can't go back to the diner. You just lost your job over a fat joke." "It was a matter of respect," Roman said. His voice was a low rumble. Maggie let out a sharp, cynical laugh. It was a terribly sad sound. Respect doesn't pay for groceries. Respect doesn't keep the heat on. She wrapped a thin, cheap bandage around his largest knuckle, pulling it tight. "You guys, you prideful, broke guys. You think throwing a punch solves the world? Now you have no income. Where do you sleep? Do you even have a place?" Roman looked at the top of her messy, damp bun. He swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth. "I have a place. Is it safe? Because those guys you hit, they deal out of the projects on 8th. They're going to look for you. You shattered that guy's face. Let them look." Maggie dropped his hand. She looked up, her hazel eyes locking onto his. The dark circles under her eyes looked bruised in the dim yellow light of the single floor lamp. "Stop it," she demanded. Her voice cracked. "Stop acting like you're invincible. You have duct tape on your shoes. You don't have $20 to your name. You can't fight the world, Roman. It will crush you. It crushes everyone." The absolute sincerity in her eyes paralyzed him. She was terrified for him. A woman who had nothing, a woman who had every reason to be bitter and selfish, was sitting in a freezing apartment, genuinely grieving the hypothetical ruin of a man she barely knew. He had passed the test. She had shattered the test. She had rendered the entire concept of the test utterly pathetic. Roman opened his mouth. The lie burned on his tongue. "I'm not poor, Maggie. I run this city. I can buy your debt with the change in my cup holder." He wanted to say it. He wanted to watch the terror leave her eyes. Before he could form the words, the sound of heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Not one set of feet, 3, moving with synchronized, heavy purpose. The floorboards didn't just squeak. They groaned under the weight. Maggie froze. The colour instantly drained from her face, leaving her pale and wide-eyed. "The cops," she whispered, pure panic seizing her vocal cords. "All those guys from the diner." Roman stood up. His posture shifted effortlessly. The slouching, defeated janitor evaporated into the frigid air. His spine straightened into a rigid line. His shoulders squared. The muscles in his jaw locked tightly. He didn't look toward the door with fear. He looked at it with absolute violent ownership. "Roman, hide in the bathroom," Maggie hissed, grabbing his arm, trying to physically pull him toward the curtain. "I'll tell them I haven't seen you." He didn't move. He felt her desperate pull, but he stood like a concrete pillar. He looked down at her hand, gripping his sleeve. "Maggie," he said softly. The rasp was gone. His true voice emerged, smooth, deep, and chillingly calm. "Stay behind me." A heavy fist pounded on the thin wood of the door. 3 sharp, authoritative knocks. Roman gently detached her fingers from his arm. He walked toward the door. Every step he took was deliberate. The prey had vanished. The apex predator had returned. He turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Polly stood in the dimly lit hallway. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal pinstripe suit that cost more than Maggie earned in 3 years. Over it, a dark wool topcoat shed droplets of freezing rain onto the rotting linoleum. Flanking him were 2 massive enforcers, their thick necks bulging over stiff white collars, their eyes scanning the hallway with cold, mechanical efficiency. The air in the cramped corridor instantly thickened with the sharp scent of ozone, expensive bergamot cologne, and polished leather. Paulie didn't look at the peeling wallpaper. He looked directly at Roman, his expression a mask of professional urgency. "Boss," Paulie said. His voice was respectful, quiet, but it carried the weight of an anvil in the tiny apartment. Roman stood in the doorway, blocking their view of the interior. He didn't blink. "How did you find me?" "You left your burner phone on the counter at Mick's when you grabbed the girl," Paulie replied. his eyes briefly flicking past Roman's shoulder before snapping back. The local precinct called it in. Dispatch reported a guy matching your physical profile nearly decapitated a low-level Sullivan runner on table 4. I intercepted the call, bought off the responding officers, and tracked the burner's GPS before Mick tossed it. Paulie paused, his eyes dropping to the cheap denim jacket Roman wore, then back to his face. "The car is downstairs, Mr. Costa. It's time to come home. The Sullivan family is demanding a sit-down over the broken nose." Behind Roman, a sharp, choked gasp pierced the silence. Roman closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The sound tore through his chest like a serrated blade. He turned slowly. Maggie was standing by the kitchen table, her hand resting heavily on the stack of final notices. She wasn't looking at Paulie, or the massive men in the suits, or the sheer violence they silently promised. She was staring at Roman. Her hazel eyes tracked from his duct-taped boots, up the stained denim jacket, and finally rested on his face. The rigid posture, the commanding aura, the total absence of the defeated, exhausted man she'd bought coffee for. She put the pieces together in real time. The math finally made sense, and the sum was devastating. "Boss?" Maggie whispered. The word sounded foreign in her mouth, tasting like ash. "Mr. Costa?" Roman stepped back into the apartment, pushing the door halfway shut to obscure Paulie from view. "Maggie, let me explain." She backed away from him. It wasn't a tactical retreat. It was an instinctual recoil, as if she had just realized she was locked in a cage with a tiger she had been trying to pet. She bumped hard into the edge of the kitchen counter, knocking over the jar of peanut butter. It hit the floor with a dull thud. "The $20, she breathed, her chest heaving. Her eyes darted wildly around the room. "The way you handled those guys at the diner, the mop." She stopped, backing away, her hands curled into tight fists at her sides. The fear in her eyes rapidly crystallized into something much sharper, hot, searing humiliation. "You're not poor," she stated. "It wasn't a question." "No," Roman said. He kept his hands visible, palms open, resting at his sides. He refused to lie to her ever again. "I'm not. You own things. People call you boss." Yes, a terrifying silence stretched between them, broken only by the aggressive rattling of the window pane. Maggie looked down at her own bulky sweater, at her scuffed boots, at the rusted tin first aid box on the table. She looked at the red ink on her bills. When she looked back up at Roman, her eyes were swimming, but her jaw was locked tight. The betrayal radiating from her was suffocating. "My life," she started, her voice trembling violently, "is a joke to you." "No, Maggie, never." "Shut up," she screamed. The sheer volume of it shocked even the men out in the hallway. It was a raw, guttural sound torn from the deepest part of her chest. "I cried yesterday because I had to choose between paying for the heat and buying my blood pressure medication. I skipped meals so I could afford to pay you back that $20. Roman took a step forward. "I know." "You don't know anything!" She grabbed the jar of peanut butter from the floor and hurled it. She didn't aim for him. She threw it hard against the wall. The plastic cracked, sending a spiderweb of fractures through the cheap casing. "You played dress-up in my misery. You put dirt under your fingernails and thought it was an adventure. You watched me agonize over a plate of French fries while your men wear suits that cost more than my life." Roman absorbed the words. He didn't defend himself. Every syllable she spoke was a factual, undeniable indictment. "I was looking for someone real," Roman said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He wasn't pleading, but the absolute truth bled into his tone. "Every person in my life looks at me and sees a vault. They smile at me because they are afraid of me, or because they want a piece of what I have. I needed to know if someone could look at a man with nothing, a man who was nothing, and still treat him like a human being. So you made me a lab rat," Maggie sneered, tears finally spilling over her lashes, tracing hot, angry lines down her flushed cheeks. "You tested me, and you passed." "I don't want your grade, Mr. Costa," she spat, wiping her face aggressively with the back of her thick forearm. She pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Get out of my apartment." Roman looked at her extended finger. He looked at the fierce, wounded pride radiating from every inch of her broad frame. She had nothing. He had everything. Yet in this freezing, rotting room, she held all the power, and he was entirely at her mercy. He didn't argue. He didn't throw money on the table, that would only insult her further. He reached up and unbuttoned the cheap denim jacket. He slipped it off his broad shoulders and let it drop heavily to the linoleum floor. Underneath, he wore a simple, fitted black t-shirt. Without the bulky, stained jacket, the sheer, muscular reality of his physique was undeniable. The disguise was completely shed. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a sleek, matte black leather wallet. He didn't take out cash. He pulled out a single, embossed white card. He walked forward slowly, telegraphing his movements so he wouldn't startle her, and placed the card on the kitchen table, right on top of a final notice envelope. "I lied to you about my name and my money," Roman said quietly, holding her gaze. "But I did not lie about how I felt when you defended me. I didn't lie when I sat in that booth with you. You're the most terrifyingly honest thing I've ever encountered in my miserable life, Maggie." She didn't look at the card. She kept her eyes locked on his, her breathing ragged. "Leave." Roman nodded once, a deep, respectful bow of his head. "I'll handle Mick. You still have your job if you want it, and the guys from tonight won't ever walk down your street again. I swear it." He turned away. He walked to the door, stepping over the discarded denim jacket. He pulled the door open, revealing Paulie, who was waiting in absolute silence. Roman stepped out into the hallway. The contrast was violently jarring. The freezing, desperate poverty of the apartment behind him, and the insulated, violently wealthy world of the Mafia waiting for him in the corridor. "Boss?" Paulie asked quietly, noticing Roman's bare arms and the lack of a coat. "We're leaving," Roman said. His voice was dead, stripped of all emotion, a steel vault locking shut. "Call the accountant. I want the debt portfolio of the collection agency on 5th Avenue, bought out completely by morning. I want every file shredded. Do it quietly." "Yes, boss." Roman didn't look back as he walked down the squeaking stairs, the heavy footfalls of his men echoing like a funeral march. Back in the apartment, Maggie stood frozen for a long time, listening to the silence return. The rattling of the window pane seemed louder now. She looked at the cheap denim jacket lying dead on the floor. Slowly, her legs trembling, she walked over to the kitchen table. She looked down at the embossed white card resting on top of her overdue electric bill. There was no logo, no address. Just a single name printed in stark black ink and a private phone number beneath it. "Roman Costa." She reached out and touched the raised lettering. Her thumb, rough and callous, traced the ink. She closed her eyes, the smell of cheap vanilla lotion and lingering expensive ozone swirling around her in the freezing room. She hated the lie. She hated his arrogance. But as she touched the card, she felt the faint, undeniable thrum of an engine turning over in her chest. Roman finally dropped the disguise, but the fallout was explosive. Maggie refused to be bought, standing her ground against a billionaire mob boss in her freezing apartment. But with her debt secretly erased and Roman's real world closing in, their story is far from over. Will Maggie call the number on that card, or will the Mafia tear them apart first? If you want to see Roman fight for her forgiveness, hit that like button, share, and subscribe.